Hello everyone, I planned to make this video for a long time and the latter has finally come for the obvious celebrations of the 80th anniversary of Operation Overlord. I will be covering the latter in 3 videos that deal respectively with the planning, the preparation, the D-Day proper, and then the consolidation until essentially June the 21st, 1944. I hope that you're going to enjoy this. It's not unfortunately going to be like, say, romantic, nostalgic or emotional reflection on the value of Operation Overlord, the D-Day, the broader meaning, like for the history of the world, etc. But I promise at some point we will get there. As you know, I cannot reveal my identity. I actually have interesting war stories from my family, and I'm also the kind of sentimental guy. You've probably noticed, aside from my superficial harshness, that likes remembering, likes talking about the past and all this. There are reasons for which, say, I don't do it. First of all, you don't know where I'm from, what kind of also ideas I have in general, more contemporary historical topics. So today's video is not just about Overlord. I mean, it is first and foremost, but let's also take it as a symbol, so in this specific historical times, to start reflecting through other videos on also contemporary history, contemporary warfare. I will surely make, there is a degree of randomness in this level of planning. Paradoxically, the cycle is more reliable than my own choice, but I plan on, in fact, expanding very much on the history, especially of 20th century warfare, and not only so. There will be the time, like the day in which you understand where precisely from, and especially what my family, you'd be surprised what my grandfather was actually not a famous person, but very close to one in a military sense, and that's also an interesting side of the story, not too rich in detail, but still. And as you know, instead, my family was from the Axis side, right? My country was the Axis side, and therefore there is something non-obvious about my say my historical views, and so how I came to develop also my system of values, and how I tell history, and why, which sides I take, and so on. I know that talking about sort of more contemporary connections can suscitate some sort of political, say, conflict, and it's unpleasant. Like, I try to keep the channel. My channel is very political, as you understand, but it is in a historical sense, right? People often confuse the expression of certain specific takes as my personal ideology versus history, whereas I actually developed this through studying history, through learning history, and through, in fact, coming up with ideas that objectively I also, like, I don't know at least anyone who has my same value system, so sometimes it's even difficult for the others to place me on the, say, through the compass, and I understand that, so I will be sort of clear at that point. So we will be able to talk World War II also in more, let's say, poignant, possibly meaningful, like relevant ways, also as far as what I think about, which is actually a lot, right? Some of you don't know that I actually am interested heavily in contemporary, in modern warfare, and I would like actually to bring Schwerpunkt there as well, step by step. As I always say, I'm just a humble medievalist, but I have this tendency to explore stuff, and let's hope that this series is also significant for any of you, for your personal memories, what like Overlord meant to you, and just I know that the majority of my audience is Anglo-American, so it's interesting, like, to to hear this from people who are fighting on the other side, right? Without the obvious factionalism. And I'll stick just to the overall, let's say, essentials of Overlord, because it's such a huge topic that is also painful to butcher down just to like 3 videos. Doesn't matter how long they can be. I am for, say, strategical, militarily logical clarity, so I thought to stick to that, even at the expense of certain details or anecdotes, etc. I will insert some aspects about moral considerations and moral forces, etc. But we will surely talk more about Overlord, D-Day, and more about all this, including the broader, of course, context of the war that will brutally, in fact, say, minimize it as an introduction, but that will always provide with food for thought and for Schwerpunkt, surely in future videos. Right, and there are some perspectives as well on this, meaning how do you start? This is probably the most difficult thing to do for a military story. Where do you start telling the story of this? Right, without making too much philosophy, there is, especially from an Anglo-American side, that of course is also like, because these were this is the protagonistic side of Overlord, and I say Anglo in, of course, in the broader sense of what had been the Commonwealth plus the Empire, of course. But there are 2 dates that you can see as laying the groundwork for D-Day, not its inevitability, because, say, the broader thing of bringing the war into Europe from the Atlantic side is one major, of course, political and strategical need, and so that's what we were focusing on. But so many things could go wrong in the first place, right? Also on other fronts. But May the 10th, 1940, and December the 7th, 1941, and I don't think I need to explain what these are truly the moment of, say, the greatest commitment. From one side, probably I told you this would happen, trying to appease, and the other side, which was sort of more, again, very part of the Axis policy and strategy that struck very bitterly at the heart of the American giant that since World War I had started playing really a major role in spite of the almost connatured isolationism in, of course, in managing world affairs. So the swift German conquest of France and the Low Countries in May and June 1940 had succeeded quite powerfully, if you think about it in a symbolic and moral sense, in ejecting Britain from the European continent, which was an enormously powerful statement. I really want to cover Falk-Gelb at some point in detail, because it's also very misunderstood at times, thing like as if the Nazis had to deterministically defeat both Poland and France, and just simply like the French sacked, and or simply like the Dunkirk miracle happened, as if the actual miracle was the Nazi commanders almost self-sabotaging each other, right, and actually being in a much better strategical situation that they even realized they were before all those soldiers managed to cross the channel to safety. All right. So it's sometimes really that level of randomness, and or like it's always responsibility. It's never randomness, but say in a way of say cognitive deficiency. Also that to this day, because I don't think that we have studied World War II in a say much of a complete way. It's like too much of a bite to swallow. I speak from 13th, 14th century perspective, thinking, oh my god, that's really a lot to unveil, to think comprehensively. How do you study the 20th century, any topic of the 20th century in general? It's an incredibly difficult side of the story, and yet I think that people tend to think we actually know how things went, but they're incredibly quickly, which ipso facto proves that we actually don't, to pick sides based on, in fact, very different dynamics. And no, I'm not making the pro-Nazi side at all, right? I think that World War II was a much less heroic and romantic thing than we tend to imagine, but absolutely not in the sense that, we were imposed some sort of Anglo-American narrative on it. In some cases, yes, including, however, for example, the reevaluation of, for example, German honor and chivalry, and lots of other aspects that went simply unnoticed and were actually dramatic for so many people before the war, at least in Europe. That is really what also I'm really interested in. Much of the narratives are, look, things were happening between, in China with the Japanese Empire, massive war, we forgot about that. Yeah, that's also kind of true. But that's not quite the point. I mean, you must be, like, if you are born and raised in a particular environment, it's very important for you to understand what the proximity to the cultural, the historical, even the personal proximity to the events can add as an advantage to those who weren't there. So, at least as a Westerner, I think that we have a lot to dig into what really, like, this whole thing was really about. But unfortunately, I can't digress simply on this topic today, right? Just we can maybe see some aspects of this as far as Overlord is concerned. We also know that despite what happened in June 1940, the Nazis failed to break British resistance, which is also one of the other keystones of the year of the war itself. The Battle of Britain was lost by the Nazis in August and September. The Nazi military victories were not translating into that success on the war front that simply, right? And Britain was not even seriously ever threatened in a naval sense, like that was in fact the major problem. Like the Nazis barely attempted to think at how they could even properly invade the island. And they, of course, wouldn't do it, right? And there wasn't much that could be done. We'll look at the air war, of course, that was crucial in many ways, but it was also part of a much bigger deal. And in part, it is this realization that prompted Adolf Hitler to seek alternative ways to gain an advantage at that point. And of course, the bigger deal that is, let's say, not even the elephant, but let's say the blue whale in the room is, of course, Barbarossa. His decision to invade the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, which would prove to be another costly mistake, at least in the way properly Nazi ideology had contemplated the approach to especially to Eastern Europeans, to peoples like Ukrainians, like the idea that the Slavs were racially inferior people, and this could not basically, like, they could help the Nazis, but, when the war was over, that would have just become, those lands would have become Lebensraum, and this race would have been knocked out of the war. That didn't really help a great deal to convince the peoples living in utter terror under the Soviet totalitarianism that they didn't understand it, as they still don't, like in the actual countries, nor they had any concrete, like, in fact, say, alternative to that. And that was the problem. The other being massacred by the Nazis really brought to that atrocious resistance that I can hardly, like, it was, of course, politically and militarily successful, but can hardly be seen in relative terms as the great victory of when you lose, tens of millions of people, and especially you spend other half of a century in conditions of utter moral and material and, frankly, human misery, while countries like at least Western Germany or Italy or even Japan, like, start blooming, right? Thanks to the Western allies. So again, we must skip the Eastern Front. Germany found itself bogged down in that protracted and bloody war, to say the least. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States, that were truly a global superpower by now, was growing increasingly concerned about being drawn in fact, what its rank was calling to be properly in this global conflict. And that's why December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese, as the Nazi allies, of course, suddenly trusting the United States into the war. Right? It was this pivotal event that, in many ways, because of course of the lion's share that the Americans had on Overlord, marked the true beginning of the same operation, and set the stage for the Allied invasion of Normandy. Today we talk about different aspects, from the planning to the what was happening, of course, on the other side, how forces were concentrated, and analyze, the political and strategical implications of this all. Now, even before, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. strategists had been grappling with the challenge of defeating Germany. Right? This is what great powers always have in their closet. How do I knock out that power? The Americans had it for Japan way before the war, but since from generations. I will actually make a video on that because that's also very fascinating. The Americans concluded that, especially at this point when Germany had, of course, taken over most of Europe, that the most effective way to achieve a decisive outcome against the Nazis would be to launch this massive amphibious invasion in Western Europe, pitting the main strength of the Nazis and their allies against the superior manpower and resources of the Western, we can't call them democracies for the sake of convention. I'm not making passive-aggressive, hypocritical jokes. I'm literally, you know that I have a problem with the etymology of the word democracy. That is anti-traditional and doesn't actually reflect accurately, unfortunately, the political realities, of course, of the best countries that exist in the world today, without any doubt or risk of, without any chance of comparison. And there would be a lot of history to make about the respective countries, but we, again, don't have that much time. Now, when the United States entered World War II, this became, the fact of invading Western Europe, the primary military objective, right? However, achieving the goal would require a lot of work, and especially a lot of time, while things were happening, especially on the Eastern Front, but not all. America had only just began to mobilize in 1941, right? And the British resources were already stretched to the limit in that circumstance, with basically handling the Nazi threat alone, right, through their naval shield in further action that, in fact, would start together with the Americans in Africa, in Greece, in the Mediterranean in general, and we will see part of this. Now, some U.S. planners believed that the invasion of Western Europe could be feasible. They decided not to enact the invasion, but that they acknowledged that it was operationally practicable to carry that out by late 1942, right, when of course the Eastern Front was turning the tides, and let's say the Nazis were heavily invested. As you know, we were talking Stalingrad, let's say, in the same months, etc. Also, like in part this was in fact influenced by the events, like also in early 1943 there had still been doubts about this. And in fact, there is a history, right? Of course, consider that the guys in charge were World War I veterans, and especially the British, that are the people that in some ways sort of interiorized for sometimes also in, say, secondary reasons, the bloodsheds of the Somme, of, the trench war and so on. And that because they had always been very careful in many ways about their demographic resources, that they rarely conscripted in their military history, even when having a world empire, like it happened under Napoleon, happened in World War I, but say in this sense, just sort of emergential reasons. Now, this was the age of mass warfare as well, but as you know, they had, this is something that would be criticized, for which, I don't know, Montgomery, for example, would be criticized for, etc. Like, this is not, we're not going to get into that, but in especially avoiding this, in being cautious in some ways. First of all, they had also this terrible experience, like in the last 2 years in the new war. They felt besieged and were hesitant to spend their forces against such a mighty enemy, even when the Soviets were doing their own war, say committing so many Nazi forces, right? And in part, that was also the deal. The British argued that it would be better to let Germany exhaust itself against the Soviet Union, while the Western Allies pursued a peripheral strategy, targeting exposed areas of Festung Europa, such as North Africa, Sicily, and Greece, and delivering destruction on the German industry, together with the French and the Italian one. Without, frankly, Barbarossa could have not been feasible, and the same population, through what was like the Anglo-American combined bomber offensive. This is important because the British would act in many ways cautiously, gradually, tidily. They didn't have enormous resources, and often the performance was not even that enormous. Just the fact that they fought, say, against the Italians was giving them some edge on an enemy that had more shortcomings in them. And they also cared extremely, and this is crucial for understanding Overlord in many ways, and also how the rest of the Battle of Europe was fought. Mostly they needed a massive amount of logistical safety. They needed to be fully supplied before launching a major operations, because these were the generals planning. These were the same guys who suffered thirst and hunger in the trenches, or actually outside the trenches during World War I, because that aside from movies that show you guys getting out of the trench being shot immediately in the head, like most of the attacks, I made a video about trench warfare at some point, were actually crossing for like a long time the kilometers of no man's land to get against enemy, the first line of defenses, that also contrary to the technologistic BS that machine guns cut down everybody, and there was no breakthrough. They would actually be taken, right? The problem is, of course, there were different layers behind, and in order for supplies to arrive, refurbishing the spent units, by the way, after the assault, they would have had to cross this no man's land that had been a completely disaster terrain, and so this idea that there would have been radically costly frontal assaults sort of terrorized them in some ways, and they wanted at least to be incredibly well supported before that, so much so that we will see it in the next episodes. Actually, the expected losses for D-Day in particular were much higher than the ones that would have actually occurred, that weren't that light at least. There were accidents, as you know, bloody Omaha, etc. But let's say in general, they thought that, at least in the worst case scenario, they had to be realistically prepared to by approximation, it would have had something like, I don't know, 50,000 casualties, like in the first day. That wasn't, but a fractional in reality. But here we're talking also about the broader picture. So the idea was sapping Nazi strength through the aforementioned strategy, sort of, again, trying to break German power in the continent and eroding it, especially from Southern Europe, while, again, the Nazis were mostly disproportionately committed against the Soviet Union. And then, only at that point, by having softened up the enemy adequately, launching the invasion of Western Europe, catching essentially Germany already reeling in defeat. There were also differences between British and American thinking in general. There is like, which movie was that? The one with Steve McKean, like, The Great Escape, that shows like how a Nazi camp guard tells, if I'm not wrong, I don't remember who was the character because I loved the movie, but I haven't watched it in a long time. Told him, but look, in back in the day, referring to the war of 1812, like, because this was an American guy, said that the British burned down your parliament, like trying to insinuate this old, reactivating these old grievances between the British and the rebels, let's say. And that, of course, at this point were not much the thing, but there were things of this kind. I mean, let's not forget, you can see it for propaganda today, it was just like that at the time in many ways, in spite of the differences. Like, there were lots of people in Britain, in the US, that actually supported the Nazis, said, why are we making war to Hitler? We shouldn't be doing that. We should think about our own country, and all this kind of, BS. And there were also many different reasons. Think about the enormous amount of, even just by cultural, ethnic proximity of Americans of German descent, right? And so many, like, sympathies also for ethnic, say, racial supremacism, all this kind of stuff. That's an interesting, like, eugenetic law, as you know, was present in the United States, in Sweden, countries that had all sort of different roles. Also a bit behind the curtains, speaking of Sweden. There was, of course, a concern and some actual concern for and some actual frequent disagreement. For example, the US planners deemed the British approach indecisive because, in part of the aforementioned strategy, of course, the Americans could deliver many more resources than the British could in the first place, and the latter were a bit understandably more, say less available in that regard in proportion. The Americans also acknowledged that it would take time, of course, to accumulate the necessary manpower and material, and so that the thing was mostly on them at the end of the day. Consequently, they adopted peripheral strategy in 1942 and 1943. So there was all this build-up of forces in Britain while the war was raging elsewhere in North Africa, in Italy. And throughout this period, Allied leaders converged, as you know, so showing a bit this fortress Europe surrounded in the world, holding conferences in places like Quebec, Casablanca, Cairo, Tehran, that were not just, of course, the occasion in which they would be able to hammer out a unified strategy with many other forces in, say, of course, in the same countries, but also they were also under Anglo-American control. But let's say showing, of course, a united front in general, politically speaking, in the world, right, and sort of their force creeping closer to the heart of Nazi power. So it is especially at the Tehran conference in November 1943 that the decision was made to launch the invasion in 1944. All right, where again, November 1943. In March, a joint planning staff was established in England under the leadership of Major General Sir Frederick Morgan. Who, unfortunately, I don't have time to digress on all these very, very important names, but at some point we can make some little videos on the key figures. Now, this team had already begun preliminary planning for the invasion and would continue to play a crucial role in the months that follow. Right, they were tasked just already in the previous years to start toying, to wargaming and thinking this how to lay out the plan. And now we're starting to work for real, for really enacting it. In January, General Dwight, so this was actually in March 1943, right? So not in 44. The following January 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Forces for the European theater. What can we say? Do we need to present Eisenhower as the greatest commander of the 20th century? Many people still think things like, oh my god, it's Rommel, it's Guderian, but man, if you understand what Overlord was, yes, Eisenhower was the greatest commander of the 20th century, point, just by scale. There is no other alternative to this, right? There are great abilities in doing particular things, but waging war by scale is the greatest of all, right? And Overlord could go wrong just by a few inches of deeper or shallower water, or a slightly rougher sea, right? The entire freaking thing could depend on that, right? Now, I advise you to check out my Von Kriege series, and especially the chapters on the moral forces required by commanders, right? And especially thrashing that entire nonsense of, it's the soldier in the front line. It's, the soldier in the front line can get killed in the most horrifying ways. I can understand that side of the war. But the moral burden that commanders-in-chief have is unmatched at any level, right? I know that populists do not like to hear this because they detest standards, they detest success of other people. Nobody cares about them. This is not a channel for them. Here we don't care about lesser people. Remember that. Now, with nearly 2 years of experience, at that point commanding the inter-allied forces under his belt, Eisenhower was definitely and uniquely qualified for that task. The planning staff, now it's an interesting story, initially comprised something like 500 officers and 600 enlisted men. It began to rapidly expand. We're talking 1,200 officers and 3,700 enlisted men. And there were people from different countries. But in spite of this, it would integrate seamlessly. There was normally if it was an American in charge, there would be a British, I don't remember the term, but it's sort of a supporter assistant, which was a way to, avoid exactly the possible friction between, the Americans and the British, so that each nation and the various ones, depending on, of course, also the Commonwealth forces, would have their own sort of closer point of reference. It would be a dialogue at a higher level. Eisenhower's immediate deputy commander was Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, right? So the entire, of course, basis of operation, the same, as Eisenhower would be in command of, of the naval forces, right? And that were in turn, commanded by a Royal Navy admiral, and so also the air ones would be essentially controlled by the aforementioned Tedder, etc. So the British were literally given their sound, obviously, land and water support under some greater let's say, the American direction. Montgomery would be in charge of all the land forces during the operation as well. So we command technically also all the Americans, but we will see this better. Now, Morgan's original planning staff had already addressed naturally most of the enormous challenge and specific challenges for that specific operation associated with the invasion itself. Arguably the most important aspect, at least directionally, at the beginning was choosing the landing site, right? And the choice fell on the Norman coast, specifically between the Seine River and Cherbourg, for reasons that we will appreciate better now. For example, you could blow up all the Seine River bridges for preventing the Nazi forces like to arrive, as they were mostly concentrated in the northeast, right? So you would have this important geographical barrier as an ally would have just to rise up the Seine to arrive to Paris ultimately. There were all some greater reasons. They had thought about Brittany, for example, or even the Cotentin Peninsula just in the west, where part of the forces actually were to land, and the idea was to cut off the Germans there, which would actually be accomplished after a while. We'll see it in the other videos. You can even say that Normandy was the most ideal location. Despite this, it offered, however, several advantages, including its proximity to British airfields and southern ports, and naturally the much less formidable Nazi defenses compared to the Pas-de-Calais area. We will look now at the Atlantic Wall and its consistency, because of course the Nazi forces were imposant, but really not the finest ones, nor with the adequate resources, especially considering what was happening on the Carpathians. They had to draw especially forces from France, and like everything was at stake for both sides, right? There's also, of course, the Allied air superiority. At that point, it could isolate further Normandy. That was, in fact, more detached from, say, the core of Nazi strategic reserves. And so, again, by blowing up the bridges on the Seine, but also on the Loire from the south, right? There could be a lot of time saved, especially for establishing the bridgehead and pouring, as that was also, like, it tells you a lot about the work behind it all, also in logistical terms, beyond like the insane amount of about 2 million in the first month, right? Which is utterly insane. And it's not even to say, as we will see, that on D-Day things went as they had to go. It's not just about the losses, or we're talking about like let's say the failure in occupying the main centers that like the planners had hoped for, right? And risking at that point, like, to be pushed back into the sea, at least by some degree, because as we'll see, the Nazis had terrible problems themselves, and being at least in a situation of potential vulnerability, just resolved itself gradually. But at the beginning, wasn't even just okay, we simply landed, it's okay. Like, they had to fight through, as you know. The Battle of Normandy was very, very heavy. Like, consider real 40,000 KIA, summing both sides at least, right? There is all a debate about that. We will see it some other point. Now, the overall Allied plan for operations in France was dubbed Operation Overlord. You had a branch of it, essentially referring to the seaborne and landing components, that is Operation Neptune, right? Meanwhile, a secondary invasion was even planned for the south of France, dubbed Operation Anvil-Dragon. The latter would be, however, postponed, at least due to a shortage of assault shipping, which naturally was crucial for supporting the Norman landing. At the end of the planning stages, General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, who would, as we were remembering, ultimately command the troops ashore, expressed concerns about the initial scope of the landings. As a consequence, the invasion plan was modified to expand it, including 5 divisions on a 100-kilometer front rather than 3 divisions on a 40-kilometer front. This would be very important because, as you know, the resistance on some beaches was really very hard, and it was not overcome immediately. Like concentrating too much forces on this narrower front would have, at least in part, also like crowded it a little bit more, but as you understand from the math here, but also subjected it to a higher risk, because again of the resistance that could be individually met and the forces that the Germans could concentrate simply against them. So this is actually a pretty good example among the many of British caution there. Like, it of course brought to further work, further time required, but it was also a great part of the success. In particular, such expansion would facilitate the capture of Cherbourg, that was, first of all, the only major port in the area, and a crucial transfer point for further operations. Schwerpunkt, as you know, is at the top of the Cotentin Peninsula, so this, it's a widening of the front and a specific landing assigned for, in fact, the westernmost one for, like, heading in that direction, like cutting the base of the Cotentin Peninsula was a consequence of this as well. The other objectives were as ambitious as capturing Cannes on the first day, and that tells you how, like, it wouldn't really happen. The Germans managed to retreat in good order and, defending it for a while in the following day. So it was really vital to widen the landing front and allow, in fact, to inject sort of with lesser pressure, like the majority, a greater amount of, and a tighter amount of forces. And Cherbourg would dramatically help in transferring men and material for further operations, so that was really, really important in all of this. As the invasion plans was taking form, the military machine was put in motion. The toughest and most battle-hardened US and British divisions were withdrawn from the Italian front. That had been quite a thing. Some of these guys had also fought in North Africa. So they were seasoned fighters, poised to unleash their fury on the beaches of Normandy. At the time, like, military science was not aware of the implications of, say, fatigue, protracted, after protracted engagements, the good 40 days of combat after which you're better like an instructor than a fighter. But, we're talking also a very punching force. We shouldn't be diminishing what these guys were able to do thanks to their military experience that is not easily replaceable, exchangeable for something else. Now, the pace of reinforcements from the United States was also accelerated. The Allies literally scrambled to amass the necessary forces to execute such daring plan. Meanwhile, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay was overseeing the painstaking concentration of this massive, it's notorious that Overlord was the largest seaborne operations in history. We're talking about 5,500 vessels, including transports, landing craft, naval escorts. They put at sea at the beginning 200,000 men, right? You needed the fire support ships. You had to, the minesweepers, etc. You'll see how it started, really. And the air forces, too, had a crucial role. They were marshaled under the command of Air Chief Marshal Sir T.L. Leigh-Mallory. And with a calculated precision, Leigh-Mallory unleashed his aerial formations upon the Luftwaffe. The first wave of bombers from the US 8 Air Force targeted the very heart of the Luftwaffe's industrial might, right? We're talking about probably the aircraft factories, drawing out Germany's formidable fighter squadrons into a costly battle against the US escort squadrons. This was a very fierce air combat raging over northwestern European skies, and the Allies would manage to exact, because of their also enormous industrial capability and strategic planning, a heavy toll on the German fighter forces. There were attrition dramatically. Well, we will see now how Germany was already under dramatic pressure. They were running out of young men, and say this didn't help. Like, the objective was to properly to bleed white the Luftwaffe, so that they wouldn't, as they would in fact, put practically any resistance in the air in Normandy. Now, the Allied air forces turned their attention to crippling the Nazis' communication networks across Western Europe. It was crucial because, of course, like the Nazis worked by internal lines. They had their own, centers of power in continental Europe, and there was a concrete risk, of course, of, say, seeing a concentrated counteroffensive on the Norman beaches, and the more the communications had remained intact, and the higher the chance. So bridges, locomotives, railroad yards were relentlessly bombed, reducing dramatically the transportation, communication, contact capacities all across Europe. And in fact, the most important thing here, remember, was not making, of course, the Nazis understand exactly where this would have happened. For example, like, lots of pictures were being taken at this point at a very low height to increase, like, the visual accuracy of the very beaches, with, like, I don't know, where the machine guns emplacements were, what kind of fortifications existed. And in order not to make the Nazis understand, like, where that the attack would have been carried out in Normandy, right? They literally risked, like, all these pilots by making them fly low, just for no equally, at least, expendable purpose, along the entire Atlantic wall, and people died, of course, because of this. There were, of course, preparations, like training simulations going on. There were some cases of friendly fire, in which I think as many as 450 allies were killed in some mock landing, either in, I don't remember, was it Ireland or in Britain. On some occasions, some Nazi torpedoes killed 700 allies, somewhere of Scotland, while they were practicing the landing operations. So we're talking about, just again, we know, okay, the epopee, the fact it succeeded, but the interesting thing, militarily speaking, is, and morally, of course, is just think about that nobody knew whether it would succeed or not. There were high chances of this failing, right? So think about the actual willpower to carry this out, and also having this incident and reflecting on the war, on the distant people, and on the sacrifice, in fact, of many that wouldn't actually live up to see whether all their force had been in vain or not. Like, this is a very touching thing, as always. All right, this is the unpredictability of it all. Like, that's otherwise war would not be fought in the first place. Finally, in the weeks leading up to the invasion itself, the Allied air forces also honed their focus on the same German coastal defenses, so that they would prepare the decisive showdown specifically on the Norman beaches. As the Allied forces carried out their air interdiction campaign, intelligence operatives played a cat-and-mouse game with their German counterparts. We will see now what the whole game really was. Of course, they were feeding them false information, mostly hinting at this through a famous Spanish spy that was playing both, was actually from the Allied side, but was also cooperating in part, like intelligence works like that, to also grasp information from the other side, that the landings would have been on the Pas-de-Calais in July. Right, it was also sort of the more likely thing. Of course, the Germans knew that we will see now their side of the story, because they perfectly knew that the invasion was imminent. They had been calculating this, and in many ways that are also difficult to explain in a single video. Of course, this was the sort of best, more useful time. Aside from the fact that it was already a race with the Soviets going on, we mostly calculated after Overlord succeeded, but in practice, as we've seen, the game was already there. Like, the Cold War had begun way before actually World War II cooled off, and it overlapped with that. But it's fair to say that Overlord could have not been done later, like to the same level of success for how like the war eventually went. Like, even had it succeeded, right? And it could have not objectively been done before, because it would have been too early, right? So it was just really a masterpiece, to say the least, of planning, of carrying out the operation, of just a display of military capacity. And of course, the Nazis, as we were saying, were well aware that the invasion was imminent. They also began to prepare. However, the Allies had to find a way to keep the enemy guessing still about their true plans without arousing suspicion. And it's not like the Nazis didn't know that the Allies could land in Normandy. Of course they could. Like, they didn't think. Like, I don't think that any person who knows anything about World War II thinks that the Nazis thought, no, it's just Pas-de-Calais. Like, they fortified the entire coast from Spain to Scandinavia. So it's not like they hadn't anticipated that. Naturally, as we've seen, Normandy was slightly less peripheral, but it was a good compromise, and so the gamble was absolutely worth it, right? And the Allies were extremely good at not revealing where this would have happened. Like, the Germans at least didn't have any particular hint that it would have been Normandy other than Pas-de-Calais, aside from the false information that they knew could be false as well. But like, would have been concentrating together with the other information that came from the intelligence overall. And consider about keeping this quiet. Like, there was a general was demoted and sent back to the U.S. in shame by the same Eisenhower, because he had revealed at a party, just as an act of cockery, that the invasion, also the date of the invasion, or at least the fact that it would have happened before June the 15th. And I don't think the Nazis learned of that, or at least, I don't know, it's possible, but I mean, you have literally millions of people who know this, right? So even if the same soldiers in many ways did not know everything, but they were isolated starting from May, right, from the rest of the population in Britain. So that's also quite fascinating how so much could be kept secret, successful for such an enormous operation. And in part, this succeeded because of the creation of a complex series of cover plans known as Bodyguard. Right, this effort essentially involved creating a fictional army group led by General George S. Patton, who was supposed to spearhead the invasion. You know that Patton was already famous at that point. Think about the race for Messina, the Tunisia, etc. He was the guy that, as we've seen also in the video about the Battle of the Ardennes, if you're interested in, would actually display that full might of the, not just much the spearheading, but the entire planning and logistics behind that of the American armored forces. Now, in reality, this was a deception. Like, Patton was given a small elite force comprising mostly engineers and signal corps personnel, tasked with maintaining dummy installations in eastern Britain. That would show as if he would have had, in fact, to that's close to Pas-de-Calais, and it would have served that direction of invasion, and he was so much the guy that could be launched in that spearheading operation. That, let's remember, like Pas-de-Calais, that we don't analyze it today because that's not where the thing historically happened, but of course it had a much closer, say strategically was closer to Germany, to some very important also blue water ports that would have allowed the Allies to pour in much more forces had the landing succeeded. So it would have in theory saved them a lot of time at least, and but not lives, because Pas-de-Calais was much more fortified, and likely the landings would have failed there. To further muddy the waters, the Allies created false indications of landings, of course, in other areas, like including Normandy itself. Because what do? You make these fake indications, and there is nothing in Normandy. Like, the Germans would understand immediately that you would be landing there. So this was done like randomly, equally, to prevent any German analyst from concluding that the real invasion would take place anywhere, actually. So maintaining basically also their positions that were already strategically ordered according to a likelihood hierarchy, right? Meanwhile, a network of Allied agents operated in France in cooperation with the resistance, preparing to rise up in support of the Allies where they would have landed, right? I will talk separately about the French resistance, because as much as it was important, like for French history, like with the goal abroad, like the same French, there were the Poles, like many, as you know, many refugees from countries that been knocked out by Germany before had been fighting in Africa, in Italy, and so on. But objectively, French resistance wasn't that big of a deal that was made. Like, it was very important later for building up Europe and realize. I mean, I don't know. Strasbourg was taken by the French back in there is some broader meaning in France of all this, but one of the actual myths of World War II is that French resistance was this incredibly powerful thing. It really wasn't. Like, let's be honest, the entire Europe didn't have this radical resistance that really managed to do so much. And actually the strongest resistance ever was the Italian one, and especially actually the communistic aspects. It's a pretty dark story overall, but say, how much do you hear about the Italian resistance versus the French resistance? The first one is the latter one is a meme. The first one is, so we do really need a lot of care anytime we handle World War II in general. Glory also to the French resistance, of course, for all their sacrifice, their military bravery, etc. But overall, like in the broader picture, you can't quite say that was a major force behind the entire thing. They were very crucial, however, in the early stages of the operation. There is no doubt about this at a local level, especially, and they also paid dearly in many circumstances. So there was a clever counterintelligence operation. Naturally, the Allied agents successfully tracked and sort of turned, for example, Nazi agents in Britain, using them to feed misleading information back to the enemy, and so on. Because they're really everywhere, right? And you can't have an effective espionage system if you don't let foreign spies inside the system. That's how it works. Like every intelligence works like that, because otherwise you can't get any information, really. Or at least not the ones that you more profitably need. And it's a war fought at that level as well. So let's focus for a moment on the Nazi side, the Nazi sort of perspective, as people like to, like on YouTube, but like there's thing, oh, let's see this thing from this guy's perspective, which is mostly means, okay, let's cosplay these guys that allegedly nobody told you about, because I'm going to reveal that in war, as von Clausewitz teaches, there is a war of reciprocity, that it's always like the two things intertwine, and you can't teach one side if you just automatically don't know anything about the other and simply narrowing it down to a sort of, identitaristic side interpretation of the war. So at the beginning of 1944, the Atlantic Wall, that had been Hitler's vaunted project, was objectively and largely a hollow boast, right? However, the tide of preparation turned when the Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, renowned for his cunning and tactical prowess shown in North Africa mostly, but he was one of the guys spearheading, actually the actual spearhead in France back in 1940, was appointed commander of Army Group B, right? Responsible for the specifically like the Channel coast, all defenses. Rommel, first of all, he's a very fascinating figure. As we know, there is all a mythology surrounding him, and when you redimension him militarily speaking, you realize also what a hell of a commander he actually was, but for that specific scale and with all the limits of a man, it was just like a cat in many ways, but it has been made a bit more of something that is passed down to history in a way that really wasn't. But in any case, he was there also like a symbol, right, for the same Nazis. He was clever and capable, and he definitely committed himself to this task. He was a very strong-headed, intense man, and he cared very much. Of course, he embarked on a grueling tour of the entire coastline. Here I have a lot of pictures of that. Also together with von Rundstedt, but let's say like he was in charge of the thing, and he would personally inspect every division under his command. His relentless energy and drive led him to even purge officers who were less than cooperative. This ensured that his plans for defense were executed with precision and rigor. And in spite of the dramatic lack of resources in function of the idea of what especially Hitler had wanted, something like, for example, a defense, the fortifications in warfare alone are zero. Like, they acquire strategical value only when they are manned. Like, Hitler had envisaged 300,000 men. And of course, Germany had none of that to place on the Atlantic Wall. Right? Again, they were running out of young soldiers. Like, for the Eastern Fort, they could barely hold this as they would have liked. As a consequence, the defenses were much more stretched, right? But that's why Rommel committed himself so much to this. As the result was actually a still formidable system of defense that would have, in fact, posed almost a vital threat to Overlord's success. He envisaged as many as 220 million mines, but would actually get in northern France only almost 6 million, actually probably less, probably on the coast. I think something between, we don't even know, I think something between 1.5 million to 4.5 million. There were all like other preparations, for example, the famous say anti-glider obstacles, heavy posts sunk into the ground with mines attached, etc. Supported by very thick layer of obstacles on the shore, reinforced by concrete fortifications on the higher ground overlooking the beaches, the cliffs, and so something really really well done for the resources available. Both von Rundstedt and Hitler believed, generally speaking, as it's fair to say most Wehrmacht leaders, that the invasion would occur at the Pas de Calais. Rommel questioned this notion, not because, as some think, he allegedly got it, because we want to think that Rommel got everything right because he was so cool and everything. It's not really it, right? It's just that there was obviously a set of options that the same, Hitler and von Rundstedt, just that we mentioned them, acknowledged. Otherwise, they would have, the Atlantic Wall, as we know it, would have not been erected. As we've seen, Hitler wanted something actually much more imposing, right, to prevent the Allied invasion of the West. Let's say that, however, Rommel was more cautious about just thinking of in a strategical planning, operational sense, that things should have been handled just in function of an invasion of the Pas de Calais, right? There were several other high-ranking officers of the German military that the threat posed by a Normandy landing would have been significantly more substantial. Exactly because Normandy had been neglected in that sense. Had they landed there, there had been actual simulations. Actually, as we will see now, when the other video, when bad weather occurred in the days right before the invasion, most German officers in Normandy went to Rennes to participate to a war games convention regarding this very topic. The same Rommel sort of went back to his wife's on her birthday at Semina. There are all these anecdotes, etc. We don't have much time stopping to smell the roses, but the general atmosphere, of course, from the German side was, well, yes, these are sort of war games. It could be Normandy. If the Allies land in Normandy, we could have the serious problems and we should reinforce it more, say, but the allocation of resources was also not something you could simply decide by yourself on a large scale. There also took time to rearrange things. And so some commanders had understood that things could have been really more serious in the case of Normandy, but after all, there were so many question marks that was true also for the Allies, that you can't claim that somebody had got it. I solved the Rubik's Cube like it's Normandy. No, right? It could be Normandy. Obviously, it's a wide provincial area. You can absolutely think that a landing can happen there, but there's also the rest. What about the rest? So you know that the relation between Hitler and Rommel was starting being strained, and so the struggle over the aforementioned resources allocation in favor of Pas-de-Calais was sort of a lost cause, so that the same Rommel wouldn't probably insist too much. This was all evident, would have sort of overcome them. The problem there was, how do you actually attack with field forces in the first place once these guys have landed, and what kind of strategy do you want to adopt about this? And also at this level there was a debate, which is also more shaded, if you want. Rommel was in fact convinced that the invasion had to be stopped on the very beaches, right? So with a force that should have been preemptively concentrated next to the landing area, right? And so that would have had to strike exactly in the moment in which the Allies were getting ashore as quickly as possible. There were 10 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions in reserve, and it was a struggle over, in fact, how many of these forces should have been allocated for this specific strategic task, or a more sort of attendistic one, if you want. Why did Rommel think that this was a better strategy? Well, in the North African campaign, the Allied air power had been really a thing, especially considering the nightmare. North Africa was the worst theater possible, strategically speaking, and communications sucked, right? There was a problem for many reasons. So when you confronted an enemy that had air superiority in general, and you have bad communications, and you have to move panzers back and forth, you are in deep trouble, because this is clear. Also, there would be a problem for the Allies in the same Normandy. The bocage does not have really great roads, and some are so small that so thin that the tanks cannot get onto them. And Rommel realized that had the Allies, of course, attacked en masse, and of course there was all this interdiction campaign all across Europe, the first thing would have happened is that they would have destroyed communications from the air immediately, therefore rendering incredibly difficult the rapid deployment of any strategic force in the critical areas, and specifically the landings, where, in this sense, Rommel was right that things would have had to be coped with immediately. So preventing probably the bridgeheads to consolidate. On the other hand, there was another philosophy that probably was worse, that was owned, however, by von Rundstedt, that argued that it was more important, to actually allow the Allies ashore, and to only then identifying their greater concentration so that it could be struck at that point with a mobile counterattack by the concentrated might of the panzers, which also does make sense because of another reason, that is, the naval artillery, especially during the Allied invasion of Sicily, had proven to be quite hurtful for the tanks, right? So the idea is that the Nazis were short of forces in a general sense. They wish they had had more. If they had immediately involved their armored divisions on the shores, it would have taken heavy losses, which actually did happen. Right, at some point on the same day, Nazis' counterattack managed to knock the Canadians out almost back into the sea. But it's naval artillery that managed to inflict heavy losses on them, sort of gradually softening them up and obliging them to retreat. So in the mess of the general operations, things would have been complicated, and you couldn't simply, like, there is not a perfect science to know how things would have really gone, all right? At that point, the sort of disagreement between Rommel and von Rundstedt brought the former to appeal to Hitler, which also made things worse. Rommel had a habit of complaining, and Hitler was very dissatisfied with this. But he understood, of course, Rommel's strategic point of view, which was valid, and he resorted to a Solomonic solution. The Führer, in fact, remained above the two commanders, and he split forces in two, right? Some of the panzers would be under Rommel's direct command, others under von Rundstedt. And yet, that's also a problem that would occur during the Battle of Normandy later on, is that Hitler prohibited both commanders to commit the panzers without his explicit approval. I mean, at some strategical and tactical level, this would happen. Also down the hierarchical line, during the Battle of Normandy, the situation was evolving sometimes, like with orders arriving after 1 day after the communication of the situation on the ground had changed. This had been paradoxically a problem, like with, I don't know, the French in 1940 that had this sort of lack of autonomy, which instead the Clausewitzian tradition of the German army actually had also being rewarding, as much as you know, the Blitzkrieg, the Bewegungskrieg actually, as it should be more properly called, was based since the Franco-Prussian War on that level of, you know, autonomy that the German officers were given, and together with that much trust. In all this, of course, imagine the situation. Just imagine, it is true that the Germans in France had been just in the last years spending the vacations there, so they had it easy in many ways. But now the imminence of the Allied assault was sort of unescapable, also mentally speaking. And so there was a great anxiety mounting up. You have this 1.5 million German troops sort of pondering on the fact that they were on the eve of the invasion. They didn't know where that the Allies would have attacked. It would have been like a tremendous outpour of fire from a much sort of more powerful enemy that, however, in that sort of choke point of the landing grounds, would have had to risk everything. And so the Germans definitely had a chance of preventing them from succeeding. Speaking of the concentration of forces, like how things were really sent in, and how green light was given, and it really happened. Next time we'll talk about the day proper. Right, today we arrived up to June the 5th, so that's how I made the videos like this. So at the beginning of June, the Allied troops began boarding ships. Paratroopers were concentrated at airfields. All personnel were placed under strict guard. They were confined to restricted areas to ensure maximum security. The actual info, how it would have happened, was just to be given shortly afterwards, and you can imagine that's sort of the most, for me at least, the most fascinating part of it all, like the waiting, the incumbents of this, the excitement, the terror, the sort of the awareness of this great endeavor, right, as it was called, that for how it was about to happen. Like, now we know, I don't know, I think it happens in everybody's life when you're about to do something really important that can go wrong, right? You have this sense of fatality of, let's say, now this is it, this is on me, like we are in, right? And it's fantastic. It's in many ways, if you're attracted to this, especially a male thing, because it pertains to that level of aggressiveness, but especially of gamble, right? Of excitement towards the game, towards the chance, towards this. Okay, like if I risk big, I can be rewarded big, and it's the properly pertinent to the second person of the Clausewitz trinity, the military, that has gambling as the most important. It's not hatred. Like culturalists mix this up. They tell you that military men are barbarians, right? Whereas the actual barbarians are the people that have blinded hatred. Whereas the military is properly attracted to this Russian roulette, right? And politics is actually reason. So that's why von Clausewitz is not for populists, but also for people who care about fantasy as opposed to reality. And I could spend some words on this because it always moves me a lot. And admittedly, this is one of the few things in my life that gets me emotional, right? I don't really feel emotional even, I don't know, when somebody dies or whatever, but certain things, including like Overlord, are, to me, if I really start thinking about it, they are deeply moving, and it's something incredible in my life. And that's why, like, I find also this video is very, very reductive for what I would like really to transmit. And that's why I hope we will be talking more about Overlord in other videos. It's just a sort of presentation. But okay, let's go on with this. Like every aircraft was repainted in a distinctive invasion scheme, featuring famously 3 broad stripes on each wing for facilitating recognition. This is really normal, as you know, like also from recent events. Like meanwhile, the Royal Navy deployed. There was so much preparation to this that is utterly insane. That's why I feel bad skipping on Moses. But for example, like this is one of the details. Like they deployed midget submarines to sea, right? And they scheduling their arrival off the landing beaches to coincide with the landing craft's arrival. And the already tight security measures were further tightened, with even sort of the diplomatic pouch being exempted from immunity. For example, the traveling to the embarking areas was effectively prohibited. The press was briefed on the operation before being locked up with the troops. And so everything was that well ordained. The Allied air forces intensified their attacks on the Loire and Seine bridges. This started happening actually along all the entire length of the Atlantic Wall. But of course, these Norman targets were hit. And special attention was given to the German radar installations to throw like communications, say spotting capacities, whatever, into chaos, with the majority of the Norman ones being destroyed. However, satisfactory number of installations were left intact in the Pas-de-Calais area in order to purposely enable the Nazis to detect a mock invasion fleet preparing to set sail. So the day after, they would have immediately realized what had happened, but in the first hours, the Allies bought time, also because the Germans would spot that mock invasion force in the north and not deconcentrate their forces from there immediately. So a very well laid out plan that worked exceptionally. In parallel, you had to ensure mine sweeping being carried out before, of course, the invasion force would actually cross those waters, and at the same time a safe perimeter channel had to be laid out by mine layers, planting new barriers effectively sealing off the channel from German submarines and surface crafts that could disturb the landing force. As we've seen, there wasn't too much to be afraid of, because also, navally speaking, we didn't talk about this, but the Allies had gained, of course, I made a video about the U-boats, actually, a couple of years ago, explaining how at this point things had started going downhill for the Nazis as well, in spite of the earlier success, right? So that wasn't too much of a problem. But mines along the coast were, right, for allowing the landings and all. They were quite dangerous. There was also another aspect, of course, was weather. That was possibly also the least, it is actually the least controllable aspect, but not much in the sense that they wouldn't. In fact, the Allies had an edge over the Nazis, because by controlling the Atlantic, actually they knew in advance what kind of weather would have arrived, right? Because their stations were already in a place that could forecast the perturbations, arrival, and so on. And this did give an edge to the Allies. But as we were saying before, just even a more perturbed sea, slightly more perturbed sea, some other issues connected with wind, whatever, would have, also partly with visibility, there were some reserves from the side of the Air Force, right? That, because as we'll see now, bad weather had arrived, and actually the invasion had been scheduled for June the 5th, the very June the 5th. But on the 3rd, the meteorologists predicted that the weather would not be conducted to a successful operation. It was bad weather. And that's why, again, the Nazis had said, okay, well, bad weather. When it arrived in delay, they still, okay, for some days, we understand that now better weather is going to be here, and we are out here for a while. They lowered the guard. On the night of June the 4th, with the weather forecast for June the 6th indicating improved conditions, although not ideal, a significant conference was convened at Eisenhower's headquarters. Montgomery, on that occasion, who, let's remember, was set to command the ground forces in all of this, believed that the invasion should proceed, despite the unfavorable weather. This was really important because Eisenhower wanted it, Montgomery too, and so the Air Force was perplexed by this, because they literally told him, we don't think it's completely clear for us. Literally, also, the sky could prevent the visibility, the adequate, carrying out of the operations for the airborne, the launches for the bombardment, etc. So this could be a factor in this, but it wasn't really that, right? This was mostly about actually getting everything was interconnected, but it was mostly about exploiting, in part, the same surprise that this previous bad weather, now the partial improvement that was allowing the fundamentals, right, for the invasion, for the Nazis to be caught off guard. That was the actual moment, and that command decision and weighing all the factors available and meticulously was really what distinguished Eisenhower as Supreme Commander. It was really a much more complicated thing than making it. Like a postponement, as we said before, at this point would mean a delay of the invasion until June the 8th, as the ships, by the way, would need to refuel. If they had, however, skipped these days, first of all, the next useful time would have been June the 20th, and actually because of the moon tide, right? The moon was full, which was crucial for giving more light to the airborne, and to especially rise the water level, facilitating the disembarkment, and this was the last useful chance until June the 20th, right around there, when actually 4 days of uninterrupted storm would have happened. And after that, of course, it would have been like, again, later and later, and so creating much greater problems, like also increasing the chances of being spotted, the enemies realizing the entire thing. So there is no great achievement without great risk. The risks, as we just said, associated with a security breach were growing by the hour, which is an unstoppably exponential thing. And apparently, Eisenhower, with a quiet tone, who was, as you know, a cold guy, you need that firmness, that sort of lack of perturbability, he said, okay, let's go, but very Americanly, and that's how it started, right? The next day, he would draft a brief statement, by the way, to be released also in the event of failure, which was very likely as well, concluding, if any blame or failure attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone, which is exactly what we were saying at the beginning regarding individual responsibility. And this guy made it, right? I can't stress this enough, right? The role of the leader also traditionally is everything. The guy worked relentlessly to make it happen. And the Imperium manifested through him in this enormous enterprise. Eisenhower then departed to wish his paratroopers good luck before embarking on the colossal operation. There are pictures here inserted that are so quite famous. There is a sense that you must understand as the overwhelmingly crushing pressure, this, and that need of catharsis, of elevation, going beyond and saying, we really must believe in this because it is a matter of faith, as a matter of fact. And the famous speech before the invasion is very punching in that sense. It's very simple, but very clear, very very much Eisenhower's in his character and nature, and it should be always understood and listened in the wake of this. Not much of its success, but exactly when when it was spoken, like before of it, when you didn't know whether this thing would actually happen or not. And then, of course, the fact that it succeeded so well is testament to that work. There are lots of things that didn't go as planned, both for the worse but also the better, including the losses that could be lower, but actually were much lower than expected by the same planners. And more, we'll see it tomorrow, talking about D-Day. So the vast, to say the least, Allied invasion fleet that was, again, the largest and most formidable in history, set sail, so to say, from a dozen ports. The troop ships, carrying thousands of soldiers, navigated through the middle of the English Channel, converging at a precise map coordinate known as Piccadilly Circus. As they approached, the ships were strategically organized into 5 massive convoys that were poised for their pre-dawn approach to the occupied European coast. Just imagine this in perspective, like being embarked, right? The warships range, like it was really they had colossal battleships at the time, down to small patrol vessels. They moved in pre-established positions. They all had a critical role. Everything naturally was not overloaded. Things have to be carried out orderly, swiftly, like in a way that has already been prearranged. And you know that a certain amount of things are going to go wrong. In all this, we will see the airborne troops in a while, but consider just the noise, like the thundering darkness, right, with crossed like in the skies by waves of Allied bombers loaded with thousands of tons of explosive. Like these guys were, risking a hell of a big deal as well. And this deadly payload they were carrying was, of course, destined to the beach defenses. Once you started, softening them up in that area, crushing them, the enemy will know what's going on. And largely, as we will see, things had by now sort of been understood. The main problem was where, what, how. Like it was happening, but how does it happen? It's all very clamorous and big, evidently, but the exact position of the landing grounds, the same one of the airborne, right? We're talking of more than 18,000 British and American airborne troops that had boarded the aircraft and gliders on airfields in central England. We're talking 3 full divisions as a whole were like to be scattered in areas that, as you know, in many ways would be quite chaotically determined, because many of them missed their landing zone. Some planes were taken down. Many of these forces wouldn't even really make it alive to the ground. And this confused very much the Germans further. And imagine just like the experience of being embarked, the cacophony of the thousands of engines roaring through this inky darkness, knowing that, when the lights are up, like the play is on and it's gonna be rough. Waiting for the dawn, there is almost a spiritual, ascetical, mystical dimension towards this mighty endeavor. And that's why I wanted to actually stress that properly, because, say, the moment of the waiting, the coming out of the literal darkness that had been true for those who had been pushed out of Europe across the Channel, and those who had been brought under totalitarian control on the continent, was broken into that crossing, into that landing, right? That was underway. And like it's difficult to, like, as you know, sadly enough, the best, so-called best generation, of course there are sort of like yes, they were the better generation, let's put it this way, but they're passing, right? My grandparents all passed. They all lived through World War II as adults, right? And not there, but let's say in a way that makes everything much closer. That they saw the horror, they saw that you can barely imagine what it meant for them. There is something about them that you remember. It's the simplicity, like how normal it was for this thing, after all, to have happened in its abnormality and having gone through it. So it's very difficult to even try to imagine what psychologically speaking must have felt for, even for those that would have not been engaged like directly into the, say, immediately into the carnage of June the 6th. But like, if you want to find like a good artistic depiction, I love Saving Private Ryan. Of course, it's a beautiful movie and everything, but there's some bigger message to it. It's neatly done. I mean, of course, there are some things that are not real, in not just because it's a movie, but not real also in the artistic conception of the same. It's not really important. You know that I always tell you not to think, first of all, to get history from, let's say, from movies. Like, don't be picky about, oh my god, this movie is so anti-historical because, I don't know, that guy does not have the right uniform or whatever. It's about the artistical value. And speaking of that, for all the movies that I think are telling that story, there are not even so many telling the truth. I think the classical, the Longest Day, and it was shot just a couple of, not even, like decades after the events, is perhaps, as far as some scenes as before the landing, the actual combat scenes, for considering it was a movie from the 60s, were actually very well done. But there are so many underrated movies in general. This was very famous, that were all the Hollywood stars of the time, and there was some important meaning attached even to that. But there are a couple of episodes, like before the landing, like when, there is the pilot reflecting how they had started years before, and he had been just like together with another one, if I'm not wrong, the only one who had remained. Other soldiers before the embarkment and during the embarkment were just playing cards like crazy, betting money, but completely careless about the money that the guy steals, because they were just doing that out of nerves. There is, of course, all the scene with General Mark about the Kriegsspiele and the bad weather and the cake. It was his birthday, June the 6th. There are different sort of moments that make you reflect about the waiting. Also from the side of the population, that actually, if you read the Allies' account, that they weren't actually that overwhelmingly happy at all, right? They actually meant that war had arrived to them the harsh way, and they were pretty gloomy and not incredibly enthusiastic, to say the least, euphemistically. So there are lots of aspects of it all that you can reconstruct just by studying a long time. The stuff I haven't. Like, I just have spent decades, of course, reading books or, I remember as a kid, like, I was very interested. It was my uncle had an encyclopedia of World War II. When we visited him, I used to read that. There were these, there's a famous picture of that guy shot down with a pool of blood in I think that was Omaha, and after the landing, these are things that when you actually watch like closer. I visited, by the way, I did visit exactly 10 years ago. It was this 70th anniversary. Some of the beaches at least, and I couldn't visit actually because I was making a broader tour. I saw other things, as a medievalist Bayeux that also was liberated quite soon after the landing, Cannes, etc. But it was also moving other places in France there. It's something that makes you think, like, when you actually, especially in our generation, moves away from things like Call of Duty or Saving Private Ryan, YouTube videos, all that kind of iconography that sort of distorted a bit our attention. Like, we think that everything was just in one way, or it was exasperated in one direction or another, right? I think we got too impressed with that, and so that we actually are after the meme of a video game other than actually knowing how it was. So today, first of all, we stopped to the concentration and all this, but it's just worth while speaking to people who are mostly in their 20s and in their 30s, and they're mostly guys who likely, for example, play the aforementioned video games, all that stuff. Like, just be aware that, again, things are a bit something else. Like, just, for example, concentrating on the geography of places. Look at the damn map every once in a while, right? And appreciate the distances, the sort of the speeds, like how this was carried out. Just think about banally doing it yourself. It transports you to a completely different dimension from which you're used to cognitively just imagine that. And it may be a banal statement, but I think that it can be so much more powerful in what happened there is definitely like history passing through those beaches. Besides the beautiful history, of course, that had occurred there, has been overshadowed legitimately by Overlord, but also Overlord didn't come out of a vacuum, right? So there is a history behind that. We will see a bit like the German defense is better in the other video. In many ways, they were sort of weaker, that the troops were sometimes, probably the Ost groups, like these guys from places like Russia, Mongolia, like mostly Soviet deserters that had in fact also Soviet weapons at a point. If you have visited the museums, the bunkers, you have an idea of also the claustrophobia of this, all the sense of impending doom. Just imagine, right? This is not camping, with MG-42s. This is something else, where you have the full might of the Allied Navy, like more than 5,000 ships that are bombarding relentlessly, plus the Air Force, plus this enormous force that is there, drilled exactly to massacre you in the first place. So it's something undescribable. In many ways, this is better left to the actual veterans, but just imagine also there that there's not just one or two guys, right? You can listen in there whenever the interviews were made. Like, there is all a world behind that. And lives, right? I was impressed, like a couple of years ago, I fell in love and I got heartbroken, and I was all sort of altered chemically in the brain as a consequence of that. And for the first time, it's as if, like, I had always been passionate with Overlord since I was a kid. But in that moment, among the various things that I do, including watching, like re-listening to Eisenhower's speech on D-Day at Semilia, I found myself that, again, I'm not really, like, I'm a sensitive person, I'm not really an emotional person, literally breaking down into tears, thinking for the first time, the thousands of times I have thought about this, because of that chemical alteration, for the first time it sort of struck me. I think that I sort of, when you get weakened by that, by love, you're sort of more feminine-minded in a way. And for the first time, I started imagining, like, those guys got killed that had it's banal to think, but I'm trying to transmit the feeling that we had that face, we had that, I don't know, the schoolmates, those, we were somebody's children, right? It got shot and killed on those beaches for something that, however you see it, that brought, peace and prosperity for such a long time in our homes, and that are gone, right? And there is some sort of thing mounting up from your own chest, your own gorge, and you start breaking down, desperately thinking about these guys sacrificing their lives. Of course, they weren't happy to die, but they had committed themselves to something that you may want to consider, especially in these times in history, in this way, this sort of giant, again, occlusion of our, in fact, historical, otherwise very easily and accessible historical awareness, that's how really people lived and fought and died, in a way that was considered also much more sort of natural and sort of obvious at the time. I listened to many, but really many, veterans' interviews of different wars, and I can't help to notice that, I don't know, World War II veterans may have seen the worst, being traumatized, being broken at some point, that remembers having this sort of reactivation of, sort of unease and issues. But they aren't like, say, today's generations, also of veterans. They are historically different. I can't help to see it, say, as as a person in general, but also as a military historian, they were different people. They came from a world that we have, unfortunately, started to forget in pop culture. And not just because, like, we forgot Overlord, but because, or World War II, people just literally don't have an idea of what it actually was, but because, like, we have stopped thinking that, like, the world does things and to levels that, like, the average person normally, like, refuses today to understand in scale, because it's sort of challenging the entire standard pack that should be required to them, like morally, personally, culturally. And there are certain things you really can't give an answer to, like just the respect to, for example, to the cemeteries. Like, technically, you do not know what kind of person that was. Maybe it was a son of a bitch, like, that you wouldn't like for any reason, but you can sort of metaphysically detach the fact that these people were commanded, were part of a will that was that logical and rational, and that is the one that we should celebrate as a whole. I think not the sort of Call of Duty or Saving Private Ryan cutscene about, again, Americans being gunned down by MG-42s. It's the sheer will to power that was affirmed to that. Just as it was affirmed, by the way, by the Nazis, by the Soviets in their own different way, and that, however, failed and must be considered in a traditional way, which, let's say, failed historically, broadly meant. We're not talking, of course, as we were saying before, that the so-called Great Patriotic War, of course, was an abomination, to say the least, humanly speaking, but they lost civilizationally. They had already lost, but as they were communists in the first place. But there is a world in which we live that is that much the consequence of this. It's not just, I don't know, something that happened like, oh, okay, like, you like this because, I don't know, you're pro-US, or you are this political side. And no, it's literally why you live. I have some stories from World War II in my family for which I realized that I live out of sheer, for example, somebody else's decision in a very direct way. And that also blows your mind, because you realize that there is a connection in the world that goes beyond even these radical divisions. So there is always that potential divine spark, reawakening, to cover this entire. But I think the same name Overlord is quite appropriate for such operation, because it really makes you reflect on the might of this whole thing, and depending on something so little, after all, as it can be one person's decision. And if you don't have faith in carrying out something like that, like, I don't know how it could happen in the first place. And it's not just a brutal wrestling or iron arm between some vicious totalitarian regimes. This is something that was calibrated for preserving some specific fundamentals in civilizational worthiness that succeeded later, and succeeded in the world till this very day, in spite of what people may believe. A last reflection is on the forces mastered here, because, let's say, in the operation, the Allies had a total of 41 divisions and 27 separate brigades. These were probably as a whole in England, right, with approximately 4/5 of these units being committed to the Overlord operation, right? Then you had 3 US and 5 French infantry divisions, 2 French armored divisions, the equivalent, essentially 1 Anglo-American airborne division, and 5 French independent infantry regiments available for operations against southern France in the Mediterranean theater that should have been part of the whole thing. So there was all a game behind also this of intelligence behind the availability of these forces. The Americans and British had successfully manipulated the Nazis into believing that they had about 90 divisions stationed in Britain, which of course was a much bigger force than the one they actually had. This was successfully achieved through various deception operations, such as, for example, Operation Fortitude. We don't have time to go in depth with this, but essentially they had created the fictional US 1st Army Group under Patton, as we were saying before. And overall, the Nazi estimate of the US strength was approximately 20 divisions too high, while the estimate of the British strength was a full 22 divisions over the actual number of troops. Because some of these were not full divisions. I mean, they were not entire divisions. They were just sort of brigades put together additionally. And notably, US units listed under armored brigades and regiments were actually comprised of armored cavalry groups. The Allied forces had instead remarkably accurate information about the German military strength, except for one thing that would actually become quite painfully evident instead on June the 6th at Omaha Beach. That is the presence of the German 352nd Infantry Division. The Allies had no clue, right? They discovered it when it was too late, and lots of losses at Bloody Omaha would be inflicted by that force as well. Among the German formations, only 13 infantry divisions were fully capable of conducting field operations. The majority were instead also properly classified by the Nazis as static units. These had been essentially fillers to man the Atlantic Wall, as we were saying before, largely lacking in transportation heavy equipment. For example, their heavy equipment was fixed in fortifications, so just it was connected with, couldn't be brought with them. They were just there to stand their ground, right? And hope to make it. And of course, these guys were mostly overwhelmed. The Germans had approximately some 285 divisions of different types, and although the organization varied between the two militaries, say the three more militaries that were involved in this sense. Like some units were very much ad hoc formed. The Oberbefehlshaber West commanded only 60 divisions. There were comparatively 164 divisions fighting against the Soviets, right? So this tells you, like, after all, like, still the consistent presence in France, but under very different conditions, first of all, but also much less let's say, with much less demand of resources at the moment. So this would play a role, because again, the Nazis brought forces away from France just on the eve of the invasions, because they really had to hold, again, the Carpathian frontier, and so they were further depleted of armored forces. When you look at the armored divisions of the Battle of Normandy, by the way, from the German sides, there was one that was actually Panzer Grenadier outfit. Also, when we talk about the Fallschirmjäger, we're talking about some sort of elite infantry. As you know, I presume also from video games, these were not real paras, right? They were not real airborne. They didn't have the the necessary training for that either. They had mostly been sort of parachute units listed under airborne, but not being suited for that kind of operation. That, by the way, was not needed. At this point, if anything, they had mostly to defend, and of course on the ground with the other forces stemming the Allies' advance. So there is really a lot about this history that would deserve more attention, and that hopefully we can approach in a deeper way in another video. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.